Good, everybody? All right, John, you ready? There we go. So I guess I just start reading this, huh? All right, Dave, you ready? All right, I'd like to call to order at 9:31 a.m. and I'd like to ask, as a courtesy to all, please ensure that you have silenced your cell phones. Each director received a notice of this meeting. The public meeting notice was properly posted as required by law. All directors indicated that they would be present for this meeting. Okay, at this point in the meeting, we have set aside time to hear from you, the general public. Those of you that were interested in providing comments and filled out one of the cards available at the receptionist desk will be called to make your comments at this time, and I understand there were no public comment cards received. Seeing that no one wishes to speak, we will move forward with the agenda. So, John, want to welcome everybody and just I guess a lot of anticipation in this meeting, a lot of opportunity, I think, for the board and the committee to get introduced to this topic in a way that is intentional and conversational. And hopefully, as we go through this presentation, it can be that. I know there's many questions, and I know there's an opportunity here for us to begin that dialogue. And so this is an important time for us as we proceed in this very important endeavor. So, David, I don't know if you've got anything you want to say before we get going here.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I'm not sick. I did a lot of screaming at TVs this weekend. We're really excited to have this information in front of the committee. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of detail that is yet to come. We're moving the ball forward, and that is incredibly exciting for our staff that's been working on this for a long time. A lot of challenges ahead of us. I just want you to bear in mind, there are things that we can talk about and unintentionally begin going down a road of saying things that may be used against us as permits are challenged and lawsuits are filed. So there's a few things that might, as it relates to some of the permitting and some of land acquisition in the future, that if we begin to go down that road, I may ask us to wait till we get in future meetings where we're going to be in executive session talking about things that we're allowed to talk about in executive session. So that would be the only place that we would stop our conversation. But I encourage you to ask questions and learn everything that you can and give direction and be a part of this committee and this one-of-a-kind project for the state of Texas. Yep, thank y'all.
Good morning. I want to echo what David said of welcoming you and just really, from the project team, thanking you for volunteering your time and your investment into this project. As Director Weldon said, it's a very important project for the future of the Brazos River Authority, and the work we do and the success of this project will benefit generations that we'll never see. So we certainly appreciate your time, and we want to be conscientious of that. Today's kickoff meeting will be the foundation for future meetings, and as such, it will be more informational in nature, and that's really because we're trying to connect dots. We're going to give you a lot of data, but we're also trying to build context, because data tells us what's going on, but the context tells us why it's important. So we're trying to mesh that together and start building your knowledge of the project so that we can have productive conversations as we go. One thing to note is our goal is not to bog you down with operational data in these meetings. We want to give you the right level of data so that you can provide input, help us with strategic decisions, get you the right information at the right time. So before we get started, I do want to make a few quick introductions, if you'll allow me. And a few of the project teams who have really been instrumental in helping us get going since March. I'd like to recognize from the BRA, Rachel Lane. She is our program manager. Her first day with BRA was actually the day after the March board meeting. So we handed her this contract and said, go, and she hasn't stopped yet. So she's running as hard as she can go. Another I want to recognize from BRA would be John Dixon. You may know him as the Lake Limestone Reservoir Manager, but what you may not know is for 10 plus years, he was the voice and the face of Allens Creek in the local community. He was able to establish relationships down there that we've benefited from. We've been able to take those and run with them, and they've allowed us to move faster than we ever thought we could. So on the consultant side, we have our partners at Gannett Fleming. We have Carrie Benegay. She is involved in the day-to-day administration, as well as Scott Birch. You will hear from both of them throughout this presentation today. They're partnered with HDR for the permitting, environmental, and cultural work. We have James Thomas, as well as Corey Shockley, who some of you may know. So with that, we'll get started. It's important that we kind of lay out what inputs that the committee can have and how we can have a relationship that works well together. And I'd like to start with just a really simple analogy to hopefully help illustrate that. And it's going to require us to think back to a time before we had Google Maps and Siri and things that told us every direction to go when we went on a trip. You had a map and you had a compass. And they are very complementary in how they interact. And in our example here, the project team, we hold the map. We're looking at data, we're evaluating routes, we're planning the day-to-day movement of the project. But simply moving isn't enough to get this project to the finish line. We need strategic direction, and that's where the committee comes in. You give us that strategic direction as a compass would in helping us reach our destination. You're helping us ensure that we're remaining aligned with the BRA's long-term mission, as well as giving us policy-level guidance when those decision points do come. To say it a better way, it's really your guidance will help us make better decisions when it comes to strategy and policy and some of the trade-offs that we have to evaluate through the process. So we'll keep touching on that, and you'll kind of see that play into action as future meetings come out, but I wanted to at least present that at the front. That's our proposed approach for how engagement works. So for an agenda, we've got a healthy agenda this morning. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to start with a little bit, won't spend much time. I'll give a recap on the project itself, what was approved in March. That's kind of the level playing field. And then talk about a few priorities we had for the project before the work started on site. From there, we'll have members from the project team in come up and talk about current work, the progress there, some of the information we've derived from it, how that feeds into future discussions. We'll also get James with HDR to come up and talk about permitting strategy. I want to give you a better picture of the process that we're navigating to get the required permits to get to construction. And finally, we'll wrap up with a little bit of a look forward. What are the things that are going to be on our immediate radar and certainly important for the committee to consider as we move forward? I guess we're going to cover a lot of data, but if I could really get you to focus in on one thing, we're going to talk about project drivers today. And these are the sensitivity, considerations, constraints, all the things that can impact what the ultimate layout of the project would be. So if you can start getting an idea around those as we discuss those and remember those, because those will be a big part of future discussions of this committee. So we'll start again with the recap, and I want to also say that we've included a lot of pictures, and the pictures are kind of twofold. We want you to see what's going on, but we also want you to get perspective for the site, because not everybody has had the joy of putting on snake boots and stomping around the property in August. It's a fun venture. But as we talk about these components of the project, it's really important for you to know, and this is a great example, when we talk about pump station location number 2, alternative 2, this is actually standing near that point on the Brazos River. And you can see as you look upstream, the bank and how it's been impacted by the flows of the water. So that goes into the discussion when we get there about how do we ensure that the infrastructure we develop and put there is going to be available for, generations to come. This project needs to be available. So take note of those, and if you have any questions on those as they pop up, we'll be glad to discuss those. Won't spend much time here, but I do want to just remind everyone, the project location in Austin County, we do own over 9,500 acres to develop the project. It's the majority of the property we will need, but there could be other incidentals that we need to add to that. We have a TCEQ water right that allows us to impound up to over 145,000 acre feet, and a yield of 99,650. That's a big water project. There aren't many out there that anybody's working on that are going to yield as much as that. So it's very important. We need to ensure that we have success here. A few of the project features, and this ties back again to the drivers we'll talk about throughout this project. The embankment, we're going to have a spillway to release water back into the Brazos for when people need it, our customers, as well as an intake on the river like we saw before, and a pump station to convey that water over.
John, got a question?
Yes, sir.
Just for me, could you show me the 9,500 acre boundary?
So, sorry, I should have pointed that out. The outline in yellow is the property that we own. That's the majority of it. There are some incidental pieces on the other side of the road near Pump Station 2 that are not highlighted on this. So that's the corpus of it.
9,500 acres,
Yes, sir. That's the,
which is expected all to be underwater?
not all of it.
Not all of it.
And that'll be points of discussion as we go forward. How do we configure the alignment of the dam that's most advantageous?
Sorry.
So, yeah, good question. And feel free to engage as we go through. We don't want to, no need to hold anything. So in March, the board authorized us a contract with Gannett Fleming to move forward. They've been working to complete the survey, the boundary survey, as well as utility corridor study, a geomorphic study to help understand the behavior of the river around those potential intake locations, some preliminary cultural and environmental study. Those will inform the future studies we need. There's a lot more data that we need to collect in that realm. And also a geotechnical investigation. We're looking at how suitable is the site. And our project team members will come up in a little bit and delve into that and give a lot more information on that. But I wanted to be clear in what the scope of work we've been working on includes. That way that there's clarity. On this picture, I do want to point this out. It's just, it's really introspective of looking. So this road that goes along the east side of our property, that's kind of the boundary. And when you talked about the yellow outline on the map before, this is that eastern edge. But if you'll look, you can see the river here, and that's an area, close to where one of those intakes could be. It's not a long way between those two. And this old right-of-way, that's the road that was abandoned when they had to go in and put the new road. So again, just illustrating the magnitude of the movement there and how we're trying to plan to ensure we don't run into a problem. So with that background, I do
John,
want
got
to...
another question here. Jim?
I'm not sure what the right way to interrupt you is.
No, jump in.
You mentioned that this was authorized in March of 25. Can you remind me what the budget amount we approved with that?
I sure
scope
can.
was?
Give me just a moment. It's a little over $9,803,000.
And the timeline we discussed for that, do you remember what that was?
It was going to take about a year.
Okay.
Some parts were going to bleed over a little bit. There's some lab analytical, some of the geotechnical stuff that was going to take longer than that, but it was more or less a year.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Quick question.
All right, another question.
We'll be working with Austin County, I'm sure, because that road is just a two-lane
Yes, sir. That is a two-line.
term. You might, I guess you'll have some kind of strategy where you'll sit down with them and evaluate, the kind of usage of vehicles that will be on that road. So you may have to work with them to maybe expand certain roads or something. Is that sort of a given?
There will be times that we'll coordinate with them. We've already been coordinating with Austin County on other items, but once we know, again, what the operational level of the reservoir is and where the embankment is, all of that will have to play into,
Okay.
how do we ensure the impacts of the project
Okay.
to Austin County.
Thank you.
So I want to touch on two priorities we had as we launched the project before we ever got on site. Number one was just ensuring that we had transparent and proactive communication with the stakeholders in the area. And the reason being is our property, it butts up against other property owners. For some of them, our property is their backyard. They can literally walk out within less than a football field and be standing on our property. So we didn't want drilling rigs and different workers showing up in their backyard without them knowing what's coming. We want to be a good neighbor. So to help facilitate that, we developed a kickoff letter that was sent to adjacent landowners as well as other elected officials in the area, other community members, that just laid out what they were going to see over the coming months. And we also wanted to dispel any misinformation about what they weren't going to see. They're not going to see bulldozers starting to build an embankment yet. We're not to that point. So we received really good feedback from that. Other things, we went down and met with local groups to inform them. We've coordinated with Austin County. They've been instrumental, and we've been sharing data on different projects that we've been working on that's helped us advance our project. We've been working with them on access. There was an opportunity to utilize some of their land for access for drilling that's helped us. So again, it's about being the type of neighbor that we would want. We want to have a good reflection in the community. Sorry, David, did you have something?
Talk about your new hire.
Absolutely. So let me save that one till last. We did also, what you'll see in this picture is Wallace hosts a July 4th event each year, and the Brazos River Authority sponsored a booth. Our very own Rachel and John were down there staffing the booth to talk to the community, be engaged with them and open about what the project phase was, what we were doing out there, and try to just, again, relay a message of confidence, and we hear their concerns and are sensitive to anything that they might have. We did also hire someone recently, as of last week was his first day. Garner Hancock will be our on-site representative in the area. In his role, will be able to help us kind of facilitate some of the day-to-day interaction, but also get ingrained with the community and allow us someone local that when something comes up, if we have a landowner who sees something and has a question, they're not calling Waco to get an answer. They've got a face that they can relate to there and get engaged with them. Right. The other priority we had, and this is just with any project of this magnitude and remote location, is safety. Safety has to be a top priority. We want to ensure that the workers go home in the same condition they arrived. To help facilitate that, we started with a very robust, comprehensive health and safety plan process so that as workers engage on the site as tasks are authorized, there's a plan that looks at the potential risks, the mitigations, and what to do in contingency of if an event were to happen. How do they get to the resources, the medical resources they need to ensure their protection? We also conduct morning safety meetings where the crews get together and talk about the day's work ahead before so that they can lay the playing field out and address any concerns that they may have. And finally, if there are any issues, there is a safety stand down in which work stops. Nothing is completed until the safety hazard is mitigated and all the crews are aware of what the issue was and how it can be prevented. All of this it's about compliance to some level, but it's really just more about our commitment to ensuring that the workers are safe while they're on our property. Yes, Dr. Reese. There's multiple avenues. Some of them are, as in this, it's a one-on-one conversation, but they do have cellular phones and other mobile devices that they can communicate while on site. It's a big property like we were talking about, over 9,000 acres, so they may be miles apart, some of these crews, as they're doing their independent tasks. So it's very important that they are able to communicate. Yes?
We look at the folks in that picture. Who are they, contractors, or are they Brazos River? Who's in that?
Those are
picture?
part of our consultant team. They're subs who are working on that. And this particular one, this was a lot of the drilling crew, I believe, as they were out conducting the geotechnical work and spending days upon days out there working in the lovely conditions of August in Texas. So.
And where do they stay? Like, where do they, when they go there and work all day and then they go back to where and then?
So they were able to obtain local housing. There were Airbnbs, different long-term rentals that they could use so that they could stay close to the work site and be able to be on site as much as possible versus having to travel back and forth. We tried to make sure that that was a consideration as well.
Thank you.
So with that, now we'll shift over to a different presenter. Carrie Benegay will come up and talk about some of the work that's ongoing. What I want to point out from this picture, it's another perspective picture, but this picture was taken close to the eastern boundary of the property. And if you look in the distance and see that communications tower, that's a little over 2.5 miles from side to side. Again, I want you to just start to get perspective of how big this property is. This is east and west. If you were to look at it north and south, it would be over 4 miles.
Before you move on, I was kind of waiting to hear, but one of the ways, and David mentioned it just a few moments ago, but one of the ways to avoid opposition on a project of this magnitude is with effective stakeholder communication early on. Talk a little bit more about our communication plan and kind of how it is that we're going to mitigate those concerns early on. Do we have an effective plan? Are we? I know you mentioned that we're hiring a person specifically. What's his background, and is there, for instance, a written plan? Do we know what we're doing, or is it kind of talk a little more about that?
It's a multi-pronged approach, and the parts of it are being developed. The local communication is a little different when you get into the larger, more strategic stakeholder communications plan. So in March, we authorized a contract to go and start developing a lot of data, putting data together that feeds into the next phase of work. The next phase of work will include more of the strategic stakeholder engagement process. We're actually have a firm that's part of Gannett's team called Lifeline, who we worked with before, that will help us start developing that plan. So for that part of it, that's still in process, that's going to be developed. For the local personnel and the ongoing communications that we have, that's a little bit different thing than what we have.
So can I add to that? This is something that we've been working for years. And I used to joke that I was the guy that always said, Allen's Creek is going to get started. Allen's Creek is going to get started. And we had so many challenges because of the ownership of the property and all these different things. But for years, we have been communicating to both the property owners that are lessees of the BRA, our adjacent neighbors. We've had multiple mail outs to those folks. We participate in the commissioner's courts when needed. We've got good relationships with the commissioner that this is in his precinct. We've spent a tremendous amount of time at the Capitol dealing with Representative Kitzman and Senator Colcourse and making sure that there's no surprises. So at this point in time, informing folks of what's happening and what's not happening and making sure that the elected officials is critical. Pardon me. The gentleman that we've hired is, I like to refer to him as the coffee shop guy. He's going to be the coffee shop guy that's going to be dealing with the day-to-day issues. I've made it very clear that, and it's the reason that I looked at Director Croneman and when we start construction and we have thousands of people at this site and however many years it's going to be, we're going to have significant impacts to the local community. Yes, that's going to be good economically for the local community. But I don't even want, as these drilling rigs are on site and they're leaving and coming and going, I don't want people running into mud on the streets. So our communication to the local folks and our neighbors about what's going on and where we are is going to be critical. As John said, as we move forward, different phases of the project will have different levels of stakeholder involvement. ultimately all the way to the point where the Corps of Engineers has a stakeholder, which brings in all of the entities maybe in the universe to look at this thing. So there's a lot that goes into the different areas of communication, whether it's in Austin County locally, whether it's in Travis County at the county, or in between. So there's going to be a lot of different levels and different types of communication. It just depends on where we are in the process. To further answer Jim's question, talk a little bit about the guy you hired and qualifications and what he's going to do for us.
Sure.
Okay.
He's a fairly recent graduate. It's really loud. Comes to us with some different construction management experience. He's been involved in projects where he's had to work with the public. We're going to get him in there early, get him engaged in the project. We're trying to bring him up to speed quickly. But as David said, we really want him to be kind of the local face so that people have a point of contact. I don't want them to feel like they have to call Waco and wait on a response. To be able to have someone in person who can respond to an issue, be it a fence down or whatever as David said, if there's too much mud on the road. We want to make sure that we're lessening that impact locally.
My concern is a lot of times opposition is generated only because people don't know what's going to happen. So hats off to David and the team. I think it's really important that we get out in front of the problem before it becomes an unknown. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other comments on stakeholder? Are you going to talk about that later in the presentation as well, or is now a
It's
good
probably
time
a
to
good
do
time
that?
for you to bring up,
Okay.
certainly.
So I just want to make a comment here as well, and David touched on it toward the end of his comments, but I would like to encourage us to turn this on its head. I appreciate and agree 100% that local engagement is critical to the success of the construction project. There is a worst-case scenario that construction is 8 or 10 years from now. Best-case scenario, it's 18 months from now. The only way it's going to be 18 months from now is for our stakeholder engagement to be at the strategic level early and comprehensively, which means there are people that don't want this to happen just because they represent an organization that's opposed to anything of this nature at a national level. So what we've got to do is figure out here pretty quick who the stakeholders are that impact us nationally at the Corps of Engineer level, because without a permit from the Corps, none of this moves forward. So my question is, what is our stakeholder engagement to ensure the permit is secured as quickly as possible? And I don't expect an answer right now, but I think that needs to be our priority. And I don't know if the committee has any comment about that, but when you look at what causes these projects to linger, it is the permit. And to ensure that the issuer of the permit is comfortable with signing the bottom line, we've got to make sure we've engaged with those that will oppose it. So it's at a higher level, and David, you touched on it. It could be anybody in the universe. Well, who is that going to be? We don't know today, but there'll be some organization out there that'll make it their life's calling to oppose this. And the sooner we find out who that's going to be that will impede the federal signing off of this, the better off we'll be. And hopefully our consultant is going to help us understand that. But that's the when we talk about stakeholder, that's a part of that. Now, one other thing I'd like to bring up, and I'll stop here because I don't want to get too much into this, but I think one of the things that we need to consider, and I'll just put this for the committee to think about, and I've already talked to David about this, Matt, we might want to consider layers of protocol for communication to occur at the county, state, and federal level that involve our board chair, our director, and, for example, our board chair and the commander of the Southwest Division. someone from the state of Texas. So there's a level of communication that affects exactly, David, what you were talking about at the local level. But it is a communication so there are no surprises, and there's awareness of all the competing priorities that the Corps is going to have, that we have a voice with Chair Flores, for example, having a conversation where the division commander knows that he has a peer that is interested in this project for the governor. And there being a mid-level tier of stakeholders that allow advocacy or adjudication of issues that are happening at the bottom level, which is day-to-day PM stuff. And we need to consider maybe what I'm proposing here is like a 3-tier approach to stakeholder engagement that has like an annual look at the top, a quarterly look in the middle, and a monthly look at the bottom. And the key is just communication and trying to vet out that whoever's going to try to stop this because of their reason and work with them. So thank you for letting me throw that out there. And as far as stakeholders are concerned, any comments or questions from that? Wayne?
Excuse me. I'm glad you brought up the permits because I had written those down as a question. Just mine isn't exactly like yours, but you covered most of it about the permits. Or, I mean, the permit contingencies, when they start throwing stuff, have you done this, have you done this, or you need to do this or this, and it just keeps getting put off and put off. But you covered, I think that's a good point about the permits and getting out ahead of them. So I agree with that strategy.
David, are we posted for executive session today for this topic? So okay. Because a lot of stuff we need to talk about could be an executive session that we need to really dive into, on some of these matters.
We're not posted for that today.
Okay, so we'd have to wait, okay.
I just have a comment. So, John, thank you for this initial. I do want to just take a minute and ask John or David, because it kind of touches on how this has been communicated and how we need to continue the communication, not just start a tier approach or a level of how we're going to communicate. But can we just go back to the history really quick about how we ended up the sole owner of this project? Because it used to not be, and there was tons of engagement between the BRA and Houston and the state legislature and ultimately to the Supreme Court, and how we meaning the team has already laid so much of that foundation for us. And I think it's not establishing, it's how we're going to continue what started years ago. So can you just, a quick, I know it started a long time ago, but can somebody, Matt, just real quick, and I've said this before, my very first BRA meeting, I sat right here where Rick Huber, and we were talking about Allen's Creek, and I was like, well, why don't we just buy out Houston? And David stood right there, and he just kind of looked at me and went like, and the next thing I knew, we were in executive session about how we're going to try to buy out Houston. But can somebody just give us a little synopsis of that and talk about how our levels of engagement, how it started and where we're at and where we're going?
Yeah, I'll try to get all the dates right. So
Turn the mic towards you.
I think we need to raise this thing up at some point. Yeah, I don't know how to do it, but I'll just lean down. I'll try to get all the dates right. So this was originally an old nuke cooling reservoir back in the 70s. That permit, which was through Houston Lighting and Power, was ultimately abandoned and lapsed, essentially. So the permit pretty much no longer existed. In the late 1990s, the legislature passed a bill to revive that permit, and they essentially directed TCEQ to give that permit to the BRA in the city of Houston. The city of Houston at that time was set as the 70% owner, and we were the 30% owner. Now, why that happened back then, I mean, if fast forward many years later, if we had the opportunity, we would have kicked Houston out of the room and said, give it all to us, but that's just not how it happened. And then we had just kind of a long lag in progress on the reservoir. BRA needed it worse than Houston. Over the course of that time, Houston had developed their water sources on their eastern side, so in the Trinity and San Jacinto. So they no longer really needed the reservoir, but didn't really want to let it go either. We even went through the process of attempting to convince Houston that we would begin 404 permitting and upfront pay for everything, and they could pay us back later. And we got a little ways down the road with that, but ultimately, over time, Houston would get a new mayor, they would get new city staff, and we'd start all over again. And so after that many years of being frustrated, banging our head up against a brick wall, we went to the legislature again. And in 2019, the legislature passed a bill that required the city of Houston to sell us their interest in the Allens Creek project for a number that the city of Houston themselves presented as what they had in it to date, which was $23 million. And that bill passed. As soon as it passed, as soon as the governor signed it, the city of Houston sued the BRA and they sued the state of Texas for essentially, I want to say a taking is pretty much what they were claiming. That went through multiple levels of court until it eventually got to the Supreme Court. And before the Supreme Court could hear it, we ended up settling with the city of Houston. And ultimately, they wanted more money than the $23 million. And so we ended up with a settlement agreement. And Lorelei, I believe the details, we paid them a portion of, what was it, 30 million? We paid them 15 up front, the other 15 to come if we can actually construct the reservoir. Yeah, if we get this permit and can actually construct it. They also maintained a 30,000 acre foot first right of refusal to purchase water out of the reservoir that lasts a year from substantial completion. So it's not an open-ended, you can buy it whenever, because we feel like the entire 100,000 acre feet could be used in our basin. So that's what got us here, long storied history.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for that very much. Wayne, go ahead.
No. I don't have anything.
Well, I meant to say this while you're on it. Sorry. I start looking at my
I'm the same way.
But I wanted to add to what I said a while ago, that I do have full confidence in David and his team, that they are already probably ahead of us in looking and trying to figure out how to address these issues we're bringing up. But then I hope they also understand that that is the information now that we're looking for as this committee to bring back to the board. That's the type of thing. You're getting the things that are coming into our minds and what we're thinking about. I have full confidence that y'all are probably ahead of us. So.
Yeah, and let me just say this also, and first of all, it's for me an honor to just be sitting here with y'all. I mean, this is a privilege and a really unique opportunity. But if we do not critically think through this, we're going to lose. And we are all here to win. And what I mean by that is being able to look at and analyze these issues comprehensively and critically think through them is the key to success. And so hopefully the spirit of this group is we are all in this to win. And no comment is intended to derail. It's intended to accelerate and excel. And I think that's the spirit of this group coming here. That's why there's anticipation and excitement. And I think that we're not here to stump anybody. It says we realize it's an opportunity for us to just be successful together. So.
I appreciate that comment, Director Weldon. Can we go back? Can I ask a question, Chairman? Tell me, I got The three-prong approach, I've got the top two. Tell me the third prong of the three-tiered approach.
Well, the third, the
Was that at the
last one I
project
mentioned
management?
was, right, that's
Okay.
at the project manager level, and that's the guy that's boots on the ground and the project manager. That's the people that are seeing stuff happen real time. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And Director Weldon, Director Wilson, thank you for those comments. We do appreciate it. We do want meaningful contribution to the project. So let us take that back and talk with the project team, and then that'll be something we'll be prepared to discuss further.
One more,
My comment is really quick, but I think, and I want to springboard off of what Director Wilson was saying. I have total respect for the technical capabilities of this team, our professionals. But the political side of it exists with this board. And I think that we shouldn't hesitate to use the strength of our board wherever we can to assist in this process. And I think our technical people shouldn't hesitate to use us wherever we can help.
right.
It's probably enough
Yeah,
said.
thank you, that's excellent. Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay,
All right,
John?
Carrie, if you'll come up. This clicker does work.
Okay,
The right button should have.
okay, thank you, John. Good morning, all. Thank you for allowing us to come and share the work we've been doing. So that is what I am planning to do. In March, there was an approval of we've been calling it the early work, and I wanted to walk through what we've accomplished in that early work. And as we talked about earlier, this early work phase is 12 months. Pieces of it are going to extend 18, maybe 20 months into the, starting back from March, due to just some of the scheduling avenues of the testing that is ongoing. So our first task was survey. We embarked on a property boundary and a planimetrics effort in order to obtain a legal description of the encompassing property. The last survey was done in 1999, and it lacked a lot of the details that are expected today, so we are updating that. We also wanted to have good, excellent topography data. 9,000, 10,000 acres, if you can imagine actually field surveying that to get a good topography of the site, that would encompass a huge effort. So one of our early work items was to obtain LiDAR data. And through Rachel Lane's dog horsing this, we were able to get the 2024 raw data from Austin County. And that data we've been comparing to the field data, the field survey measurements, and it compares very well. So that was a great win to get that LiDAR data at no cost to the BRA. Bathymetry, we are completing bathymetry of the Brazos River, as well as in the photo, the larger photo here is showing bathymetry collection of the several ponds that are on the property to understand the depth of those ponds and the extent of those ponds.
Okay, if I could just interrupt.
I'm sorry?
Director Wilson?
Which term? Bathymetry. Bathymetry is establishing the ground surface below a body of water.
Let's do both. Also include LiDAR, please.
LiDAR? Okay, you've stumped me. It is use of an aerial vehicle. So it could be a plane, could be satellites, in order to establish the ground surface elevation change over distance.
Right.
LiDAR also goes through, looks underneath, if I remember right.
It does not look below the,
Archaeology, see what's underneath.
so you're thinking of geophysical methodology in order to establish what type of buried elements might be below the ground surface. LiDAR is only looking at what's on the ground surface. some tree cover can impinge upon LiDAR and not get the data we need. Of course, anytime. We also embarked upon a utility desktop study. We do have 2 pipelines running across this property, so we wanted to understand the ownership and the plans of that ownership of those pipeline utilities. We also have a railroad corridor along the SR 36 on the western portion of the property. And so in order to understand and gather that utility data, we embarked upon an early desktop study. And all of these are works in progress. Go ahead, another question?
Okay. I'm sorry, you mentioned 2 pipelines. Are these sewer, or are these water, are they oil and gas related?
Oil and gas related.
Oil and gas related. And so we're going through the process of,
Utility relocates
Killing
and
it.
all of those issues. Yes, sir.
right,
Yep.
okay.
And then did you say railroad?
The railroad is not on the BRA property, but it does run along the western edge of the property.
but it adds to the complexity and the cost of the projects and the things that we're gonna have to do to make sure that we can move
I
forward.
guess Lake Texarkana would not be our model to follow then, would it?
Director Lawrence?
When you mentioned the pipelines, what about mineral ownerships and producing oil wells and all those kinds of issues? Is that something that we've addressed or will address?
Correct. All of these topics that we're talking about play into what we call the drivers of the project, things
Yeah.
that could impact that. Currently, there are no producing oil wells on the property. And I just want to be clear, these pipelines were on the property before we purchased it. We're dealing with an artifact of something that was done before us. So knowing how to manage those plays into the delta. What does the configuration of the project ultimately look like?
Well, what I'm really concerned about is the mineral ownership.
Okay. I'll get John to speak to that.
And John probably can talk about it.
Hello. For y'all that I haven't met, my name's John Dixon. And I've been involved with this property since I came to work here in 2002. And as far as minerals, when BRA acquired the project on January 6, 2000 from Reliant Energy, they reserved all the oil and gas and minerals. However, like we have at Lake Limestone, they subordinated their right to recover it from the surface of the property. And so they will be able to produce minerals, but it will be from property that is not BRA owned.
Okay, thank you.
Talking about a slant well?
That's, so they'd have to do
Yeah,
it.
directional.
So they'd have to come horizontal.
And as John pointed out, I've been all over the area, miles in each direction, and there's very limited production. Since I've been involved, we've had one request to do some seismic, and it didn't go anywhere.
The easy part's building the lake.
I'm
Okay,
fine.
John, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have another question?
Our second task is the geomorphology study. As John had alluded to, the Brazos River does meander. And so we want to ensure that the intake location, there are two in our water rights permit. We want to ensure that the intake location that is evaluated, as they are evaluated with the alternative study, have the longevity of life that this reservoir project will encompass. Our third task was the environmental and cultural study. This is a preliminary study to collect field data. We have completed the field collection and we are working on assimilating that data into reporting. This information that was gathered will be very informative during the next steps of the project. And the photo on the right is the Allens Creek that runs through the property. Our final task, task 4, was the geotechnical investigation. And this was our largest field effort and the largest effort of the early work. We began our field effort in May and commenced our field effort last week. So we had 20 plus people in the field for about 4.5, 5 months. We completed our soil and water sampling using SPT, stands for Standard Penetration Test. It is a method by which a soil sample is obtained at depth in order to assess its engineering properties. We also completed CPT, cone penetrometer testing, which is a non-destructive method in order to gather engineering parameters of the soil as well, its density, its skin frictional resistance. These soil samples and water samples that were collected are being subject to laboratory testing, which we will then utilize in a data report put together. Field testing was also completed, which involves slug testing and pumping tests in order to understand the permeability of the site soils and how these site soils will react to a reservoir loading above them. We have 11 well locations, actually 20 installation of wells, some shallow, some deep, in order to, again, monitor the groundwater level of the site. Laboratory testing is ongoing, as well as data analysis of all of the information that was collected.
All right, one question.
Of course.
On the 11 well locations, are those near the point of entry for your gathering water for the lakeside? Or will this be part of the filling up of the lake? Not at all?
No, these wells are not the intention of the wells are not for a water source for the reservoir. They may be used as a water source for future work on site. So the reservoir will be filled through pumping from the Brazos River during high water level events. And the wells are utilized to understand the groundwater level of the site. The wells are primarily located around the perimeter of the future maximum reservoir storage.
Quick question, please. Are they gonna excavate at all soil out of that to make the reservoir? Or, I don't know what the terrain looks like other than pictures. Is it like a valley already?
Two great questions. And because of those questions, we need to go back. John, will you
Let me
give
flip
a slide, please?
back, don't leave. Let me flip back. Is that the one you're referring to?
Okay, that's good enough. So the questions that you're asking are great questions, and I think we maybe missed the point on, I think we missed the mark a little bit here. I think we should have gone back and even given you some more simplistic information on the reservoir. Director Boren, this will be an off-channel reservoir, and the function will be to always pump water out of the river when we're releasing out of our other 11 reservoirs that's coming. The diversion point of 2200 CFS, that's when we can pump water when it's 2200 CFS or above. If it's below that, then we won't be able to pump
Is
water.
this gonna be a constant level lake?
There is no such thing as a
I
constant
mean,
level
is
lake in the
similar to
world.
Travis or similar?
No. So that's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. So if I could show you a map of the entire basin, there's all these other reservoirs upstream, right? And when our customers downstream ask for water, our hydrologists are looking at every drop of water as it flows in the basin, and then they will select where that water's released from.
Right.
And evaporation rates, recharging the stream. It could be that Lake Limestone's releasing water and parts of the basin are in extreme drought. So they're looking at all of that play and figuring out how to manage the water. Once this is built, this will be our lowest downstream reservoir for water supply. And if it's full, I'd say 90% of the time that downstream customers need water, we will always release water out of this reservoir.
Yeah.
This reservoir will fluctuate more than any other reservoir in our basin because it is truly a water supply storage reservoir. So we will pump water. You see the Brazos there. We will pump water somewhere out of the Brazos into Allen's Creek Reservoir when the conditions dictate that we can. And we will fill the lake up.
True
And there-
storage, true storage.
And there it will stand waiting on the next drought for downstream releases. We're releasing water, or we were a few weeks ago already, despite all of the heavy rains that we had in the spring and in the summertime. 2 summers ago, last drought we had, we released about 100,000 acre feet of water in that summer. That's about 100,000 acre feet of water sitting there. So those are some of the other benefits upstream to some of the reservoirs. So when we're talking about the wells around, we're trying to figure out water interaction, soil interaction, all of those type of things. But all of the water for Allen's Creek is going to come out of the main stem of the Brazos, and then are just very little amounts through Allen's Creek that you see to the far side of the west there. Now, what was your question?
Are we gonna have to excavate soil out of there to make
So that's-
the depth you need?
Maybe so. So that's what the soil work that we're doing now is to figure out a couple of things. What type of soil do we have? If we have the right types of soil to build the levee, then we'll excavate the soil out of there to use for the levee. These are just some really general precursory test holes that we're taking so we can understand what's below us. Once the reservoir is designed, we don't even understand the shape of the reservoir yet, okay?
Okay.
You can see the red line. Can you see the red line faintly
Yes.
here?
Yeah.
That may be where the next levee is, okay? We're also looking at potential ways of making it more of just a pure rectangle. It's all about the cost. If our soil samples show that the soils that we don't need are not on location, then they'll have to be shipped from somewhere else. Cost of the project goes way up. If the soils are here, we'll use these soils to build that levee system. So those are all of the pieces of the data that we're trying to collect now before we go to the next phase of preliminary engineering so we can begin to understand, do we even have the materials on site that we need? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Once we understand the shape, if you will, of the reservoir, then these guys will begin to understand how much we have to excavate if we don't, how high the levees have to be, how we're going to deal with hurricane influences, and all of those type of things because of where this reservoir is located. So your questions are great, and those are a lot of the answers that we're trying together before we go to the next phase to put together what the reservoir looks like. The smaller the footprint, the less mitigation we have. The smaller the footprint, maybe that determines cost up or down. So everything that we do, all of those play into a factor. Could we build a reservoir and miss the wetlands that we're going to talk about or miss the pipelines? Those are the things that we're looking at. Mitigation is an
I
unknown
don't know what the
cost.
terrain looks like. If it's real flat there, which I assume it's mostly flat.
So it is a beautiful reservoir site because everything toward Wallace and Allen's Creek is actually more elevated than the bowl that is Allen's Creek, and that's why there's a wetland there.
Okay.
And that red line kind of separates what we call Alligator Hole, which is a wetlands to the east.
That big section right there.
That big section there, we've already eliminated, hopefully, because again, the true unknown cost, these guys are experts. They can come up, every month they can come up with a new cost, anticipated cost of construction. But what we can't anticipate yet is what these mitigation costs are going to be, and that's what we're going to have to negotiate with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Parks and Wildlife. There's a ton of stuff there that we have to mitigate.
David, not to
Great
belabor,
question.
not to belabor the point, but wouldn't it be wise, I don't know what kind of saturation you have for groundwater, would it not be wise to have them as an alternative also to raise water into it if you had a severe drought going on in the upper Brazos or in the middle part of it to keep the 100,000 acre feet available?
It could be. The challenge there would be convincing a local groundwater district that we're going to pump stuff out of the ground, put it in a reservoir for it to evaporate.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah,
we
gotcha.
could run into a lot. It may be more beneficial to look at acquiring groundwater there to subsidize the surface water if the surface water volume wasn't there. But there has been in the past when we've talked about putting groundwater in Lake Granger, a significant concern about the
Yeah,
evaporation.
I get that, I understand.
Yep. Good question.
Jen?
Really quick question before, will you go back to that same slide? So all of these things that we're talking about could impact our yield. How sure are we about that yield and how much can that number fluctuate based on what you find out with all
So
this?
the yield is guaranteed through a permit through TCEQ. What we're going to have to determine is what's the best way to build the reservoir to get that yield. In the modeling and in the engineering, if there is a lesser yield at a very significant cost savings, then we might go that route. But I would suggest to you that would have to be just a few thousand acre feet versus a significant savings. This is all about getting as close to or more than 100,000 acre feet of water as we possibly can. So that's what their challenge is to find the optimum design that gets us, let's just say 100,000 acre feet of water with the least amount of mitigation, with the cheapest way to operate in a hurricane zone. Okay, and I say that because as part of this design, any levee that's built is going to have to deal with hurricane force winds. Okay, so there's something else too that the guys behind me will throw things at me, but we've got something called system operations that adds further complexity to this, and it may allow us to tweak out a little bit more water. So that's something that we're going to look at also. And that plays into the design of the pump station. We've got pump station 1 alternative, pump station 2 alternative. What we don't have here is where the discharges would be. So there's just so many variables that come into play to try to figure out how to get 100,000 acre foot, how to design the reservoir for the least amount of mitigate, those type of things. So if the cost goes up too high and the yield drops too low, then we would come back to the board and say, okay, plan B is to sell the whole property and get out from under the project. We don't think that's the case. But we're going to optimize that 100,000 acre feet of water.
Director Henderson, to reinforce that is where we're going with the project. That's the next phase, is the alternatives analysis, where we start taking those, looking at the trade-offs between different configurations and getting to what you're saying. It's about optimizing what we're putting together.
The interesting part about alternatives analysis is the Corps demands multiple alternative analysis. And one thing they truly don't care about is cost. Cost is your problem. Cost isn't their problem. So if there's an alternative that is 3 times more expensive, but they deem it more practical, more environmental friendly, more whatever, then that's the road they're going to want us to go down. And that's where the negotiations and the stakeholder with the upper hand folks, that's where that becomes into play. But we've got to figure that out so that we know what we're going to negotiate.
Okay, let me just summarize what I think I heard, and somebody take notes of this, because I think, David, you did a really good job of capturing some key variables, macro variables that we need to keep in front of us as a board and a committee and as a group. You talk about cost, you talk about capacity, you talk about mitigation, and then I'll use the hurricane, just the word resilience there, and then operations sustainability. So you got to be able to sustain it. You got to be able to have a resilient design. You got to have mitigation, capacity, and cost. And that may not be all the macro variables, but that's kind of what I caught from that, which is a good way for us to think about this. And then you concluded with what is the question that I had leading coming out of this is, I can say this because of my engineering background. There's a point where you have enough information to make a decision, and you don't need to spend more money getting more data. And we need to work together to not over design something until it's not I shouldn't say over design. In other words, if you need to make a decision about cost at the 10 or 35%, don't design something to 95% and then say, I've got what I need now, when you've got these other key decisions to be made and you're trying to get more precise information that leads to a design. So, I mean, there's a lot of holes that have been poked in the ground here that arguably are needed, but it's an iterative process. So thank you for those explanations, and let's, I guess, move forward.
Just one last thing on the wells. These are monitoring wells. They were not installed to be groundwater production wells. That was never the intent. I have a few photos of some of our preparation work in order for our geotechnical and environmental field tasks. We had 2 laydown areas. One, this is the south laydown area along Wallace Road to the south of the Brazos property. And this was the north laydown area, which is interior to the site in order for our staging. You see a couple of drill rigs there. This is an overview shot. You see 2 drill rigs, again, giving us an idea of the expanse of this site. We see the cell tower, again, in the background, and you can see the higher tree line along the top of the photo. That is what we've been referring to as the bluff or the terrace, and we actually have about almost a 15-foot elevation change from the area where these rigs are shown to the back side or the west side of the property. And a kind of an aerial straight down shot of a typical work area that was mobilized at each drilling location. And then our finished product of our boundary wells, again, monitoring wells, not meant for water producing. And then we have telemetry to monitor those groundwater levels long term. I wanted to share some of the challenges and solutions, how we feel we have made good decisions and utilized the funding that was approved in a meaningful, thoughtful way. The topography data I mentioned earlier, the LiDAR data, and obtaining that from Austin County, we were able to, in our early work process, we did have tasks annotated to create an individual flyover of the site in order to get the topography data. We also had another task that included procuring or purchasing that data from a provider. Through the sharing of the data directly from Austin County, we were able to see a savings of $560,000 of not needing to exercise those tasks. We also refined our scope. In our Task 1 survey, we had right-of-way survey. We had several planimetric surveys as well of the pump station locations. And because those intake or pump station locations are yet to be decided which one is going to make the best long-term sense for this project, we deferred several efforts totaling $385,000, deferred those to a later date, possibly, most likely, after the alternatives analysis, possibly after the permit is submitted, when we better understand which of those intake locations makes the most sense for the long-term use of this project. Several other challenges and solutions were the site conditions. This site, the photo that's shown here in the upper section, the roadways are a loose term for what's actually out there. This is an agricultural environment where they're using tractors and other equipment that can navigate this difficult terrain. The paths that are there are not stoned. They are kind of the surface material, which is a very clay sub-base material, becomes wet and impassable very quickly with street legal four-wheel drive vehicles. So we mobilized, and we had planned for mobilizing UTVs or ATVs, all-terrain vehicles, off-road, and we had tracked drilling equipment, tracked water buggies, tracked equipment in order to supply the drill rigs with the equipment they needed. We also had an issue with production rate, given the site conditions, the weather impacts. And we had originally planned for 3 drill rigs operating concurrently on the site. We increased that to 5 drill rigs so that we didn't drag out this effort in the field. And weather impacts, lightning within 10 miles, because these SPT, standard penetration test drill rigs, have masts. We needed to be concerned about worker safety, and the storm cloud, as an example. We calculated that we had an impact to operations about a little less than 20% of the time. Our project performance, scope, schedule, and budget. This is an earned value chart And the total dollar value up here in the corner, in the left-hand corner, has been modified from the number John gave you earlier. It's been reduced by those savings and those deferred items that I talked about earlier. And what this shows is the blue line is the planned spend value, so to speak, of our work based on our schedule. And what we see here in the red line is the actual cost, and then the earned value or percent complete in the green line. You can see that our actual cost was a little greater than the planned value. We were making better progress. And then as we finished our geotechnical work, we see that all coming together. And short story is that this shows a project on schedule, on following the scope, on budget. And I'm going to turn this over to Scott Birch at this time to share some additional information and how we are going to use this data collected in the early work for our future steps.
Thank you, Carrie. Again, thank you for inviting us here today to talk about this project. We are super excited to be part of this team. I wanted to just walk through a little bit on what do some of these key findings mean. So we talked about getting this data, the survey data from Austin County. And one of the key things, and we talked about it a little bit before, was we wanted to get a good understanding of how accurate it was, because if the accuracy wasn't sufficient, then we would need to get good enough data to be able to do our alternatives analysis and have some confidence in the construction cost estimates that we will be making and the potential environmental impacts. So we did a variety. We did over 100 ground truthing points to validate the data. And we found that the topography and this LiDAR data that we got from Austin County, which is part of the Houston-Galveston Area Coalition, was well within the Corps of Engineers requirements, tolerance requirements for survey data. So we have excellent data and a broad base of that excellent data. Director Crone, I think you had mentioned earlier about the tree covering. Trees, not so much the trees, but the foliage and the leaves are very detrimental to LiDAR. So most of the time, LiDAR gets flown in the wintertime when all of the leaves are off. All this data was flown in the January to March timeframe of 2024. So we got great correlation in wooded areas. We got very excellent correlation in open areas. The place where the correlation was a little still within the tolerable guidelines as dictated by the Corps, but a little more variance was in the farm fields where they would grow hay. There's a lot of grass, and then they cut the grass, and we found that because of the dense growth of hay or other types of crops like that sometimes you get a little more variation. So that information is really good. We know in the areas to be looking at as we go forward with our analysis where we've got the most variation. But again, even in that area, it was well within the required tolerances for a big water resource project like this. So we've got excellent data for as Carrie said, over $500,000 of savings. And I think one of the things that I think were really great was the relationship that the BRA had with Austin County. Rachel Lane was able to go sit down with county officials, talk to them. They were happy to share the data. And because the cost, if we had to purchase it from the HGAC, would have been exorbitant. It would have been cheaper to just redo the data ourselves. So that was a big win, I think, for the team. And I think there was a little bit, you can get a little bit of sense of the topography here. The green is, this is kind of a color map. So places where red and blues, those are the highest level of elevation change. So you can see here along the western side, there's some steep changes in elevation. So those blues show deep down cutting of the channel down into Allen's Creek. You see it all along this western edge, as we have come to call it, called the bluff, where the land sits higher and drops down into this bowl shape. And here in the green, it's all pretty flat. I mean, and you could see from some of those drilling pictures. So this red and blue line is just that kind of theoretical embankment alignment that we're looking at. It creates the eastern side of the reservoir, and the rest of the property can be used as part of the reservoir storage. So there's a lot of things that we have to think about and work through as we move through all our alternatives analysis, but having a good database is critically important. Another key finding was from our geomorphic study, and the work on this is still ongoing, but there were two things that we were really worried about as we started this project and talking with the BRA. In relation to the Brazos, John had mentioned that the farm to market road here on the western side had to be relocated because the Brazos had migrated and eroded and taken out the older portion of the road. We were worried about how fast does that migration happen? How long would it take? We were very worried about this meander cutoff. As the water comes around this bend, there's been some significant erosion on the interior parts of both. Let me see if I can figure out the top one. Oop. Sorry about. So it's been eroding inwards here and downwards here. And if at some point in time in the near future, this migration connects the Brazos, it would isolate this big meander into just an oxbow lake and cut off the potential water supply. So understanding that is really critical into designing a project that's going to be functional and resilient for the next 50, 100 years. The good news that we've gotten, and I'll just say too, the pump station site too, if that site works, it's closest to the reservoir, you have less pumping distance, it's very convenient and could be built at less cost if that site is a usable site. Our pump station site 1 down to the south, it's on a more stable part of the river, but you've got a longer pumping distance. You'd have to have some kind of pipeline system to get the water from the river to the reservoir. That is actually this zone here between the pump station and the reservoir is currently not owned by BRA, so it would require some additional real estate acquisition. It's certainly a viable solution that we need to really look at, but our hopes were if the river is stable enough, we could be able to do it up closer to the reservoir. And the initial results of the geomorphic study seem to indicate that over the next 50 years, there will be some migration of the river, but it's not as detrimental as we had maybe initially thought.
One question.
Yes, sir.
Just
yes,
a quick question. How far is that meander cut off?
It's probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile.
Okay.
I drove out here and looked across, and you can see across maybe a mile at the most.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, a second question.
Yes.
You have that labeled Pump Station 1 and Pump Station 2.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that like prioritized, or is that just like right now there's possible 1, possible 2?
Possible 1, possible 2. For whatever reason in the water rights permit, that's how they were labeled. So to not create confusion, if I were to do it, I would have said 1 is up closer and 2 is down at the bottom. But to keep it all the terminology so we don't have 2 different sets of names, we've stuck with that naming convention.
Thank you.
But it really has no driver on preference at this point.
That's executive session kind of question.
Yeah.
We're going to talk, James is going to come up and talk quite a bit about some of our upcoming permitting here in a moment, but I wanted to just kind of confirm that there's some things that we needed to really get a sense of, to try to reduce as much uncertainty as we could as we kind of developed our scope for the main contract or the next phase contract. So one of them was to kind of just get a big picture of the site. Are there any obvious threatened or endangered species nesting? Is there any clearly obvious signs of cultural resources or any of that? What do the waters, what does the stream look like? Is it a waters of the United States and along Allen's Creek, or is it more of an ephemeral stream? What about within the reservoir footprint? There's some series of other canals and wetlands. What kind of wetlands were they? So it was a very cursory analysis to try to just get a kind of a big picture sense. There's a lot more study and investigation that needs to be done in order to have a complete permit application. So I don't want to suggest that that we've concluded all of our environmental and cultural work. But while they were out there, there were no major concerning issues. There's probably some threatened and endangered species, but there was no big thing like a nesting habitat that we found or some other environmental species, endangered species that we weren't anticipating. No bald eagle nests right in the middle of the reservoir site, anything like that. We did confirm that, by looking at Allen's Creek, that is most likely going to be deemed to be a waters of the United States under the Corps of Engineer protocol, which would require when you impound Allen's Creek in an alternative where you impound Allen's Creek, that would be something where they give the Corps authority to mitigate or to permit, requiring us to get a 404 and would require mitigation. So that's an important finding. We anticipated that was going to be the case. We're pretty confident that is the case here.
Okay, question?
Yes.
Just want to be sure I keep up with all your acronyms.
Yes, sir.
WOTUS is your water of the United States.
Waters of the United States. Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay, Scott, you said that there are or there are not threatened and endangered species in this footprint.
We know that in the river there are potential mussels. There's some potential Houston toad habitat in the area. In a site, there's most likely tricolor bats, which are soon to be listed as a threatened species. So there are some species there that we are aware of. Those are all pretty manageable. There's good management practices on how to deal with those. So what we didn't find is any uncertain or an unknown species that would have some really significant impact. So we kind of confirmed that what our understanding to date was pretty much what was on the site, and we didn't see anything obvious that was a game changer for us.
Okay.
Waters of the United States means we are required to keep Allen's Creek flowing through the reservoir, right? Or not?
I think what it means is the Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over those waters, so that when you go to get a 404 permit and you're going to impound those waters, they will then require mitigation of those waters. So you'll have to be able to come up with some mitigation plan. And if you have 10 miles of stream, they'll say, well, you've impacted 10 miles of stream, you need to mitigate that somewhere else. So I'm speaking a little out of my turn, but I think that, the Corps is looking for, no net impact. If you impact waters of the United States here, you've got to mitigate that somewhere else.
I get it.
So I think this is a very good question, and David, when we bring this to the full board, I might suggest that we have at least one slide that starts with the Clean Water Act, its authorities, and why the Corps is the executive agent for the 404 permit, and while that kicks in. Because the Waters of the U.S. designation is important because that's the Clean Water Act kicks in then.
Right.
And that bullet right there, in many ways, is the long pole in the whole
That's
tent
right.
of this project.
That's right.
And it's buried here, sub-bullet 3 of slide 24. And the board needs to understand that this is the critical issue as far as time and cost to the project ultimately, because of the points you've made earlier. It's a key driver.
Yes.
Chairman, I think we also, to my miss the mark point a minute ago, I think we need to have a conversation with the board about what is entailed in that 404 and what are the cost drivers, and so that they can get an understanding of, because you mentioned it a minute ago, you don't want to collect too much data. But if you don't understand the data that you need and you don't negotiate the data that you need with the Corps, then you get to a milestone where the Corps says, nope, go back and start over. And that's where your time is money and money is time begins to cost you a lot of exhaustion. So
Right.
well noted.
Yeah.
And just so I can clarify my comment was specifically at collecting more dirt data.
No, I got
Right.
I think the key is data to support the environmental and cultural piece of this, so thank you for that.
Yes.
So go ahead, Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, these are great topics and great questions. And James is going to get up here in a moment and talk through some of the permitting, so he'll be able to clean up whatever misinformation I just said. And then lastly, as we went through the geotechnical investigations, and I completely agree with you, Director Weldon, that you don't want to get too much data up front, but we needed to get enough to be able to have a good handle for our alternatives analysis of what we would have to do with this. There was a smattering of existing data that was available. We were very fortunate to be able to find that a little more detailed analysis, which is probably a quarter of the data you would need to go to construction, a quarter to a third of the data necessary for construction, was consistent with that early data. So again, no major game changers. The majority of this reservoir site is overlain by a high plasticity clay. You guys are, if you've been out, in your property or out in the country, and when it's dry, it's like concrete, and then all of a sudden it rains and it turns into a big mud pit. That's the nature of clay. It's fantastic from a reservoir standpoint because it impedes the seepage that could leak out of the reservoir into the foundation. But it also is prone to settlement and compression and consolidation. So getting a good understanding of the nature of this clay is some of the lab work that's going on right now and some of the things we have to do to be able to deal with it properly. There's also certain types of clay in these areas that over time, if they're repeatedly wetted and dried, they start to lose strength. And then over a 20 or 30 or 40-year period, you start having slope stability failures and your embankment is no longer stable because the strength of the clay has deteriorated because of the repeated wetting and drying. And as David said, the purpose of this reservoir is to fill it up and drain it out and fill it up and drain it out. So we need to understand if this clay has that type of mineralogy, and there's ways to protect it if that's the case. But all of these things have drivers into the cost. How do you construct the embankment? And those are things that we'll be looking into as we go further into the design in the next phase of work to make sure we've got all of those things addressed.
Because I'm a Texas high school public grad, can you do those acronyms again? CPT, SPT?
Oh, yes, sir. And I apologize for all the engineering speak. We throw these around all the time and we forget that not everybody can speak our language. CPT is cone penetration testing, and it consists of pushing an instrument down into the ground, and you can measure groundwater pressure, you can measure the resistance that it takes to push that down. You're instrumenting all of it, and it gives you indication into the permeability of the soil or how much water can flow through the soil. It gives you data on the strength of the soil. If you're going to do pile design or if you're going to have some other kind of foundation design, that becomes very, very important. SPT is standard penetration testing. It also gives you indications of how strong the soil is, but most importantly, it provides physical samples. When you pull that sample tube up out of the ground, you've got a sample of the soil that you can now take back to the laboratory and run laboratory tests to be able to get more engineering data and analysis. And then APT is aquifer performance testing, or pump testing, we call it. And that's an on-site test to be able to, where you pump water out of a well and measure how much the aquifer, the groundwater drops down. So if you've got a groundwater in your soil and you start pumping out, you get a drawdown curve. And so by measuring how much drawdown you get at different distances away from that pump well, it can give you insight into what the permeability of the soil. So all of these are different ways to get different types of engineering data that we need to be able to do the analysis and do the design of the reservoir.
Thank you.
I did want to talk about, so our first task that was authorized in March was strictly data collection. And so that's what we've been doing, is getting the data ready. All of this information is going to be available when we're able to execute the main contract, which will then take us right into some of the more detailed environmental and cultural analysis and our alternative analyses. So it's very timely to have this data available so that when we execute the main contract, all these reports will be done, and our design teams can just hit the ground running as we start to move into the alternative analyses. And in that alternative analysis, that's where we go through and look at different configurations. We look at different pump locations. We look at different a full reservoir that gives us the 100,000 acre feet, maybe a reduced footprint that gives us maybe only 90,000 acre feet, but maybe there's less environmental impacts or significant cost savings. And we have to kind of put all of those into a matrix. And then it whittles down. When we do these types of analyses, we usually get down fairly quickly to 3 or 4 really strong candidates. And I think that's a place where being able to get some strategic direction from the board, how do you weigh permitting versus construction cost versus less water storage or more water storage? Those are all the kind of the dials that we can tweak, and maybe we can find one that maximizes all of those. Maybe we find one, maybe we get down to 2 where it's kind of a coin flip and that each one has different pros and cons. We can sit down and have those discussions as to which way, the board and the agency feels is in their best interest to proceed. So once we kind of get the idea of what that final solution looks like, what we think is the best plan that's going to meet the BRA's purpose and need, but also has the least amount of environmental impact, we can do some conceptual designs that are necessary to be able to turn into the Corps as part of our permit action. And our goal here will be to have a permit that answers the Corps' questions in advance, where we're working with the Corps working with our staff who's familiar with the Corps and working within the Corps' process to be able to kind of identify those key issues and have the answers to their questions, so that we don't get into that situation that we just described, where we submit a permit package and the Corps says, well, thank you for this, but you need to go out and do a whole study on Houston toad because we didn't think it was necessary. So try to anticipate what they're going to need and make sure we have all those answers, because it'll help expedite the permitting process.
I've got a question here.
Oh, sure.
Director Lattimore.
I have a lot of respect for all the work that's been done. And my question really involves maybe a detail. I don't want to get the cart before the horse, but I'll relay to you some experience that I've had, and David mentioned it a few minutes ago. I can't imagine on a site this big that there won't be some issues. For instance, we identified waters of the U.S., but I can't imagine on a site this big that there won't be things like some old burial grounds and potentially some Indian burial grounds that we're going to have to deal with. And I haven't heard any analysis or identification of those kinds of sites. And I'll relay to you my experience. I had a project that we had a 5-year hiatus, 5 years delay, while we had to relocate some old bones from an Indian burial ground.
Yep.
And it cost us 5 years
Yeah.
while we relocated that burial ground. I just can't imagine. And back to what Director Weldon was talking about a while ago, I don't hesitate to think that it's very important to get all the analysis that you have done, but I haven't heard any analysis that's talking about what I'll call the silver bullets having to do with waters of the U.S. But more important, and I see these cultural field investigations, what's been done to identify those little nits and gnats
Yes,
that
sir.
I think exist?
Yes, sir. That's an excellent question. There's a lot of unknowns because we don't know. A lot of these things are buried. They're in the ground. We don't know. So the first phase that we did was just to get instead of doing it all on maps and from old reports, to get some archaeologists and environmental folks boots on the ground to walk the site, to look for some of the evidence of these sites. And so it gave them a much better sense to be able to scope how we scope this as we're working through the details of this next contract with the BRA staff. And we recognize that there's, typically within cultural resource environmental, there's kind of a 3-phase approach. You do first kind of a cursory phase where you get a sense of what that information is. It's much more detailed than what we've done to date. It involves doing some excavation and some trenching. And then based on that, based on what you find, then you'll have a much better idea and clearer idea of what's out there. Did we find human remains? Have we found an ancient Native American burial site or cultural site? I mean, it may not be any buried bodies, but it could be something that, hey, this is where Native Americans, 5,000, 10,000 years ago used to camp and hunt and clean. And so there's all these things that we need to definitely look at. That's a fairly involved, that phase 1. I say cursory, but there's a good bit of field work and a good bit of analysis that goes into that. At that point, you have a really good idea. This is what's here. This is what we're going to have to mitigate, and you can put together then the plan for your follow-on phase 2, more detailed investigation to fully evaluate those specific sites that you found, and then a phase 3 if you had to, which would be if you found human remains and they had to be relocated, they could get taken out and moved to a different site. So it's a step process. We've just scratched the surface. As I said, there wasn't anything out there that we saw boots on the ground that was like, oh my goodness, this nobody ever talked about this, but here's a big mound that's very typical of a burial mound, or here's tombstones out in the middle of the site that we didn't anticipate being there. We didn't find that, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there. We really have to do this next phase, this phase 1, to really get a good sense of, now we've got some confidence as to what's here, and then that'll inform what we will need to do, what Texas Historical Commission will require, what the Army Corps may require. We'll put together a phase 2 plan, and then that'll guide us as we go forward as to how much of an impact. But to your point, sir, I was involved in a project where all of that was done, and they started to excavate the foundation, and they came across human remains and Native American cultural sites. and it shut everything down. They had a construction contractor that they had to terminate the construction contract while they went through the entire, and that is what we do not want to have happen, because it can just be a project wrecker.
Okay. Sir, I
Thank you.
apologize, would you tell me your name again?
Scott Birch.
Scott?
Scott, yes, sir.
Okay, and what was your title?
I'm the Gannett Fleming project program manager and project manager, so I'm kind of overseeing the entire consultant team.
Okay, thank you.
So we've talked a little bit about this. In fact, we probably talked a lot about this. There's some things here that we call project drivers that we need to kind of keep in mind. These are just some of them from the engineering standpoint, and there's some other ones as we've been talking that we can add to this list. Alligator Hole. Alligator Hole is a wetland here on the northeast part of the project site. It's specifically called out in the water rights permit, requiring BRA to do everything they can to avoid impacts to that. So if we want to, during the alternatives analysis, we will consider alternatives that impact Alligator's Hole, but it's something that TCEQ and will be looking very, very closely at. So we're going to have to be sensitive to that. Allen's Creek, as we mentioned before, is a waters of the United States. So anything we do when we impact or impound Allen's Creek through that alternatives analysis would be a project driver that we have to keep in mind. The locations of the pump station, I briefly mentioned that before. We're going to look at these two sites that have been identified in the water rights permit. We've also are planning on taking a look at a third site somewhere else, maybe to the north, just to make sure that we've exhausted all of the potential sites. We don't want to just say, well, we only looked at these two sites in the water rights permit when there's a great site, just to the north of our project that might work well. So we want to make sure we look at that. But that has a big driver on cost, real estate acquisition in the future. So those are something that we need to make sure we keep track of. The pipelines, which were mentioned earlier, and those two pipelines, I should have put them on the map and I didn't. I apologize. One runs roughly east-west across the north part of the site, and then the other one runs this way. We're kind of on the eastern edge, but kind of right through the middle. In our desktop evaluation, identifying ownership and easements, we've talked to both of these companies. Nobody has raised a red flag saying that these pipelines can't be relocated or that they're critical or anything like that. The question is, how much does it cost to relocate them? Mm-hmm. Those are some of the things we'll be talking through. So it's certainly going to have an impact on the cost of the project and potentially the timing of the project. We've got to, once we kind of decide where we're going to put the reservoir and what the final configuration is going to look like, there's going to need to be some lead time so that they can have those pipelines relocated prior to us initiating construction.
Question here?
Yes.
Director Rhodes?
Scott, the
Yes, sir.
Alligator Hole, since you said it's a designated wetland, is that for migratory birds or what was it? What's its significance other than that?
Alligators, I would think.
We'll have a bigger hole right there soon.
Okay, if you don't mind, if we could, I've got one more slide, and
Sure,
then
no
James
problem.
is going to talk about that
Okay.
and have a little bit more. Yeah. But no, it's an important question as to what it's there for. And then I did want to talk about one of the things we're incorporating into our future work is risk management. And the key of risk management, there's going to be all of these risks. And risk is a combination of the probability of something occurring and the potential consequence. So you could have something like, I'm sure this is going to happen, but there's really no big consequence, or it's easily dealt with during engineering. That then becomes a very low risk. But you could also have something that is not very likely to occur, but if it does occur, the impacts to that, to the project, to the surrounding community, to the project delivery, to the cost could be catastrophic, and that is a very high risk. So we built into our process a risk management piece where we sit down with our key leaders on our design team, staff from the BRA, to be able to walk through and talk about, here's what we see as the risks. We come up with them, we assess the probability of occurrence, we talk about the consequences that occur, and then the most important part is we develop a mitigation strategy, point number 4. We can talk about risks, and then if you don't do anything to mitigate those risks, they're just going to be, a sword hanging over your head. So we don't want to have that happen. So the key is develop a risk mitigation strategy, identify who on the team owns that risk, who's going to be working to try to mitigate it. You often can't eliminate every risk, so you just try to mitigate it to the maximum extent possible. And then we're going to track those mitigation strategies. We're going to revisit risks on a regular basis, because there may be things that we don't think about here at the project start, but 4 or 5 years into the project, something has come up that we didn't anticipate that is a new risk, changing laws, change in ownership, changing governmental priorities. And we need to identify those risks, and we may have to develop new mitigation strategies to deal with them. And as a tracker, and this is something that Gannett Fleming and HDR does on a regular basis for all of our projects. We've got a lot of experience working with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and all of their regulated dams to be able to evaluate various risks, various events that, and what their probability of occurrence, what their consequences are, what the risk is, and how do you mitigate it. So these are just some strategies. And here you can see in this matrix, you can kind of come out and plot, and you say, well, something is very likely to occur, but the consequence is very low. So it's a very high probability of occurrence, but it's only a 1 on the consequence. So it's a risk we need to be aware of, but we're not super concerned about. Similar, but you could have something that's a low to moderate probability of occurrence, less than 50% chance that this is going to happen. But if it does happen, there's a significant impacts. That's something that we really want to be focused on. So these are kind of tools and dashboards, and personally, what I would foresee for this committee is when we have briefings to be able to walk through the risk matrix and say, here's what we have identified as potential risks to the project, or maybe we don't go through all of them, but we categorize them in the ones that are really high risk. And here's our mitigation strategy, and look for feedback or assistance on how do we mitigate those risks. Particularly, there's some that are engineering, that the engineering will try to mitigate, but there's some that are more political or financial that we could most certainly use input from the board to help us deal with that. That's my last slide. Are there any other questions for me before I turn it over to James to talk about permitting? All right, again, thank you for having us, and I'm going to let James alligator hole.
Yeah, this one. I think it'd be good for me to
Forward, back.
Thank you. Good morning. My name's James Thomas with HDR Engineering. I'm a wetland scientist and a certified wildlife biologist. I've been doing 404 permitting the majority of my career since 1996. Most of that 404 permitting with the Corps of Engineers, Galveston, Fort Worth districts. So there have been some questions that I think it'd be good just to level set a little bit on what the different jurisdictional, federal and state jurisdictions are here that we're going to have to address in our permitting strategy. So first of all, the Brazos River. The Corps of Engineers has 2 main authorities when it comes to waters of the United States. The first is the Rivers and Harbors Act from the 1800s. That gives them the authority over navigable waters. The Brazos River is designated as Section 10 water, a navigable in fact water. And so the pump station
when we put a pump station that goes into, even with excavation, into the channel, we will absolutely have to get Section 10 authorization. And then 1972, the Clean Water Act gave the Corps and the EPA joint authority. I'll talk about how that's managed in a minute, but the Corps and the EPA have joint authority to administer the Clean Water Act. And so the definitions of waters of the United States right now are changing. We don't have new definitions. They've been subject to change in my career about 7 times. And so right now, as a result of the Sackett Supreme Court case, the Corps and the EPA are working on new definitions of what is going to be a waters of the United States. Based on that Supreme Court case, it will include what are called relatively permanent waters. And so those will be streams that flow most of the time unless it's in a severe drought. That was what our evaluation in this first phase evaluated is. We went out and we saw Allen's Creek during very wet, very dry periods. Most of the time it has running water or standing water, which are 2 of the key tests the EPA and the Corps are going to need to put in as part of the new Sackett guidance. So we believe that Allen's Creek will be a relatively permanent water. The other ditches, wetlands, and things that are out there may not be waters US, but it's too early to tell because we need those definitions. For a wetland to be considered water US now, it needs to have a continuous surface connection with a relatively permanent water. How you define that continuous surface connection has not been given to the Corps by headquarters of EPA and the Corps, and it hasn't been given to the consultants either. So we're evaluating this. We're kind of speculating based on the language in the Supreme Court case and some other early guidance, but that's still, we expect that in January, the new definitions. Is there a question?
Quick question.
So, are we gonna be held up because of that court case?
Well, ultimately, it should help because we believe the extent of what is considered waters of the United States will decrease. But in the big scheme of things, we should have the definitions by January, which should be well before we're into the alternatives analysis. So we should be. And our plan is to mobilize next spring, just because of the size of the site, the challenge of mobilizing around the site. This is a large area, not the largest I've worked on, but one of the largest. And it has the fewest roads for a large site that are passable when it's wet. And so we're planning a 10-week field effort to collect the data that we will need to determine what is a water of the United States and get all the delineation data we need. Yes, sir.
That, I can barely see it, but it looks like, is there a stream or something that flows into Alligator Hole that keeps it wet all the time? At the very top about the...
Yes, sir. So let me talk about Alligator Hole a little bit. It is a forested wetland. These are fairly, I won't say common, but they occur along the coastal area in low depressional areas. Down in Brazoria County, there are some large ones that are part of the Stringfellow Wildlife Management Area that are somewhat similar to this. So water comes off the bluff. This actually doesn't get fed by the Brazos River unless it's a major flood like in Harvey. Water comes off the bluff in times of really wet conditions and flows down this slough and into Alligator Hole. And only when it fills up, and the water also comes down, historically, it looks like water probably came from this smaller tributary and came into Alligator Hole. But then when the farming and ranching started in the early 1900s, they started excavating ditches for both drainage and irrigation. So our historical evaluation, we're looking at prehistoric, pre-contact potential for Native American sites, but also just the history of the site. And so what our historian that evaluated found is that starting in the early 1900s and on into the 1950s, a lot of these ditches were put in. And so some of these ditches took the place when this Now, some of the water goes into some of the main ditch canals, but also when Alligator Hole gets filled up, we believe it overflows into the canal system, the irrigation and drainage system, and drains down to Alligator Creek. So the connection, or Alligator Hole, sorry, into Allen's Creek, the connection, a key factor that we need to determine is, do these ditches really provide enough of a continuous surface connection between Alligator Hole and Allen's Creek, which is a relatively permanent water? So those are some of the key things that we're going to be evaluating. Now, Alligator Hole is not the only wetland out there. There are other wetlands that are similar but smaller along the bluff, probably in an old river meander. You could see some dark areas, dark depressions. Those are also wetlands. And so there's a question earlier about how do you define a wetland? The Corps and most other agencies define it by three things. It needs to have the hydrology that persists long enough in the soil for it to be saturated or inundated until anaerobic conditions form. Once anaerobic conditions form, then biological processes in the soil create hydric conditions so that it forms redoxomorphic features in the soil. You find them by low iron or manganese concretions, and those are the things we look at when we go out to delineate the soil. And then the third factor is wetland vegetation. There are certain scores that botanists have given vegetation of how often they occur in wetlands. So those are the three things we're looking for when we go out there. Generally, in this part of the state, if it's saturated or inundated for more than about 3 to 4 weeks, which isn't that hard to do in these clay soils, it's going to be a wetland. But just because it's a wetland doesn't mean it's a water of the United States. So we will be evaluating all the wetlands, including Alligator Hole, and trying to determine which ones are waters of the United States and which of the ditches might be waters of the United States. And the ones that are waters of the United States, those are the features under the Clean Water Act that we will have to get a permit for. So we'll get a Section 10 and 404 permit for the intake, and then the reservoir, these are all Clean Water Act 404 waters. And so the Corps will be looking at it under those two different authorities. Okay. So this is an example of, this is what we would call forested wetland or mesic flatwoods. In these clay soils, you get these small depressions. You'll tend to find that the areas that are too wet to farm, the farmers have let go back to forested wetlands. And so you'll usually find between 20 to 50% wetland areas, little pockets in these woodlands. And then there are some that are, the deeper depressions are 100% wetland. So when we start for an individual permit, these are the range of stakeholders that we will typically need to be engaged with. And so I want to talk about a few of key connection points, and then I have a couple of additional slides that illustrate this. So under those two authorities, the Corps of Engineers, that's obviously the largest federal action that will need to be part of the project. But also it's a 100-year floodplain, so FEMA will be involved in a review. We would anticipate that we'll probably have to get a conditional letter of map revision to put because it will change the floodplain to the extent that's, we have a floodplain expert on Gannett Fleming's group that's going to be helping evaluate that. And then the EPA, the Corps, as I mentioned, the Corps and the EPA administer together the Clean Water Act. The Corps reviews permit applications, issues a permit decision. They will complete their environmental evaluation under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So it'll typically be an EIS for a large project like this. And the EPA is heavily engaged, and they actually have the veto authority and can revoke permits. So you need to be sure that both those agencies are engaged from early on and understand the purpose and need of the project. The state agencies, so that the Corps needs to get concurrence from many of these other federal and state agencies, so they'll be involved in the scoping of the project. The one that I'll point out, the two really that are key on the state side, all of them are important, but the Water Development Board, if BRA needs Water Development Board funding, they have their own environmental process. What you want to do is get them engaged to where they can use as much of the information as you're developing for the Corps of Engineers as possible to save BRA time and money. And then the Texas Historical Commission, we've talked a lot about cultural resources. They issue the permits, the Antiquities Code permits for archaeologists on behalf of a subdivision of the state like BRA. They're the ones that actually issue those permits for the archaeologists to go out and do the work required. And so they're considered the state historic preservation officer, and the federal agency the lead federal agency, which we anticipate will be the Corps of Engineers, has to consult with the SHPO, the Texas Historical Commission, determine if any adverse effects are going to happen to a site that's eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So I know this is really a lot of information, but this is a strategy that we've developed over the years working on water supply projects in Texas, and it illustrates a lot of what was discussed here, is how you manage the information in a stepwise, phased approach so that you are sure you are getting the information needed to submit an application, to answer as many of the Corps' questions and the other agencies' questions as you can at the right step in the process to keep moving, but without putting so much design dollars at risk before you have a pretty good sense that you've managed that risk that Scott's talking about. And so I'll just point out a few things. So you can see we've got the Waters US, biological, the historical archaeological review, and the Water Development Board environmental process. If the Corps is involved, the Water Development Board will be engaged, but they will be collecting the concurrence information that the Corps is also getting. But they do have a very important stepwise approach too in their evaluation that goes along with getting engineering dollars and eventually construction dollars authorized. So what we try to do is collect enough information on all these key features that we've talked about when we're still at this conceptual design and alternative evaluation standpoint. Don't really take any beyond 15 to 30% and try to get down to the alternatives that we believe are going to be most permittable as quickly as possible for the lowest expenditure, but also being sure that we're doing our due diligence. I can come back to this if needed, but.
Go back, please.
Yes, sir.
There's a critical point. There's a critical gray line here that I'd like you to talk about.
Yes, sir.
And that is, if you're wondering, as we do all these studies, who's grading our paper, talk a little bit about the third-party NEPA EIS line.
Yes.
Okay. And how critical that is.
So based on the most recent reservoir projects in the region, for an individual permit, the Corps will hire a third-party contractor who will be under contract to the BRA, but they answer to the Corps, typically, in helping the Corps execute their NEPA process, so preparation of their environmental impact statement. And so the strategy tends to be, what we want to do is do our homework, do a good job on the alternatives review. They'll hire a third-party contractor. We turn over that data, and then we respond. They will help the Corps with their scoping, conduct their public scoping meetings. They will tend to help. What you want to do is do the work where they will go out and verify and confirm, but they're not doing their own studies or rework. That's the goal. Now, I will say the regulations on NEPA are also changing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But They're trying to streamline this. It hasn't been tried for a reservoir yet, but they are trying to streamline the NEPA evaluation. And maybe third-party contractors won't be as common as they currently are, but right now, the information we have suggests that for every reservoir project in the region, there has been a third-party contractor that the Corps hired. And so the question is, do you want to be the first out of the gate that doesn't use that model? Because that brings risk as well.
It's really important to understand that we are marching down a road based on a set of guidelines that are going to change while we're marching down the road. And to not go political with you, but if in 2.5 years we have someone else in office, within that next 4 years, the rules may change again. And every time the rules change, that's part of that risk registry. Just FYI. And this is a real big deal. Do we get to select who the third party is?
The BRA will have a role in that. Typically, it's a joint effort between on the projects that we've done. We will help, we'll help the client or the applicant put out the RFQ. They will submit, and then the Corps and BRA team will get to jointly interview and help select a third-party contractor.
And who pays for that work?
BRA.
Thank you.
Be loyal. I withdraw that comment.
Their overall objective is to help the Corps get through their NEPA process, so the Corps can make a permit decision. Okay, so we've talked about the individual permit as anticipated, that the Corps evaluates and makes the permit decisions. The EPA has a very important role. They have the ability to veto and revoke. Where we start the process is working with BRA to define the purpose and need, and that builds the foundation for the definition of the project. It builds the screening criteria in which we will measure alternatives, and the purpose is to explore options. The really key part of an individual permit is that the Section 404B1 guidelines that the Corps and the EPA have, the Corps can only issue an individual permit for the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. And as David mentioned, he knows it, they have 3 criteria. It has to be logistically feasible, has to be technically feasible from an engineering standpoint. Do they build pumps big enough to do what we want to do? Can you procure them? And then cost. And cost is way down on the bottom because they'll compare you nationally to what other, cost per acre foot, and you can always find somebody in other part of the country that pays more probably. And so you really want to base it mostly on logistics and technical capabilities. I mentioned we talked about the third-party contractor, and we talked about the regulatory rules and guidelines are changing. They're changing because of several things. The first, there were several recent Supreme Court cases. We mentioned Sackett. There was also the Loper Bright and Relentless decisions that limit some of the federal agencies' rulemaking authority, and so that's rolling back some things that were made from rulemaking instead of what was specifically in the law. Those changes are still happening. And so, it's hard to say if in 6 months or a year, if new guidelines will come out and how long it takes the agency personnel to get trained up on those new guidelines. So from recent reservoirs in Texas, the purpose and need needs to be based on documented demands. The alternatives analysis, what you hope to do is in the very early conceptual design phases, you want to screen out those that are not practicable and only carry maybe the 2 or 3 that seem practicable through a more detailed design evaluation. And you want to consider what impacts to waters of the United States, cultural resources, endangered species. In most cases, the Corps will heavily weight impacts to water, so stream or wetland impacts, over impacts to endangered species. Tribal concerns of cultural resources could be a major factor, but again, there are ways to mitigate those. So the Corps' evaluation is heavily weighted towards minimizing impacts to waters. The mitigation costs, we talked a little bit. I want to be careful how much we get into this strategy because of the real estate concerns that we talked about. But you want to consider the mitigation feasibility and cost early in the project planning, because it can be a major cost. There's long-term monitoring associated with those, and you want to try to manage those risks. And then the Water Development Board and the Corps has specific rules, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, where they have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the SHPO. Water Development Board takes a broader approach. Even if you don't have to get a certain permit, the Water Development Board, I think they have a list of 14 different entities that they want letters from. And so you have to go into it understanding that even if you thought there was a pathway where you wouldn't need to talk to a certain agency because you didn't need their approval, you have to educate them enough where they'll be willing to give the Water Development Board a letter that says they concur, they've reviewed, they don't require a permit. The TCEQ is really important because not only do they have the water right permit, they also have authority under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, and they will have the ability to consult on that.
David?
Chairman, just going back to some comments that we had earlier about strategy for communication. Can you go back a slide, please? There you go. We have already, BRA staff have spent a significant amount of time talking to Water Development Board, Texas Parks and Wildlife, TCEQ, because I think part of the strategy is going to be, as this goes along and we have information to share with those entities, beginning to discuss and negotiate what they're going to want to send that letter. Mm-hmm. So we're already down the road on those conversations with the state agencies.
Just to summarize, the key is to develop a defensible, well-documented purpose and need, and then evaluate the alternatives through that purpose and need with the screening criteria that you developed, and then have that summarized in an application. It really, for an individual permit, you have to have that and what things are going to be impacted for it to be considered complete. And then we want to take advantage of these changing regulations. We're a little unsure exactly how they're going to play out, but we certainly want to take advantage of those while also evaluating the risk. If you're the first one out of the gate, how, what the risk could be versus following a more traditional approach. It's important to understand the Corps' regulatory, or their drivers and their challenge. The communication processes on a big project like this, they have a lot of legal responsibility to communicate with the other agencies. So pre-application meetings, when you're ready, when you have enough information to start answering their questions, and then regular communication with the permitting specialist is important. They're dealing with staff reductions like all of our federal agencies are. And so the better we can at providing complete and organized applications will help streamline their review process. They have a heavy permitting load, those who are still there. And so we want to develop the information, understanding what documentation they need to have in their files. We want to give them that data and that information in readily usable format so it can be pulled over into the various documents they need to do internally. They have permitting metrics. They actually have goals of how quickly they should get through their individual permit and nationwide permit reviews. And so if we are responsive to the request for information that they provide us, and they see that we're going to be able to help them meet their targets, they'll focus the energy on those applicants that are providing that information. And then any that don't, they can tell them, well, we're going to administratively withdraw your permit because you're not allowing us to move. And so we want to be the ones that are keeping that information flowing. The Corps gets sued by everybody. They get sued by the environmental groups, they get sued by applicants. And so you have to understand one of their key drivers is avoiding litigation. And so we need to follow precedent. We need to understand what their process, and we have former regulatory staff that are part of our team, former regulatory chiefs, former colonels, and so they can really help us in evaluating our information before it's submitted and following precedent, finding things across the nation that may be precedent that we can rely on, and we want to provide the well-referenced submittals.
All right, we'll spend a few moments wrapping up here, and certainly an opportunity to answer any questions. We covered a lot of heavy content today, but I hope it's been valuable and given you perspective of conversations that we need in the future. So just a big picture look at the milestones to come. We're going to aggressively work to complete the work that's already under contract, getting that information ready in a form that we can, catapult into the next phase of work. Continue stakeholder coordination. We'll certainly take the comments that we've heard today about looking at different approaches to that and incorporate that into our plan. The big milestones to come are certainly initiating the alternatives analysis. That's the next big thing that we need to undertake. And that'll help us start answering some of these questions, bubble up some of the questions that come up today so that we can get your input on. And all of that culminates into getting a permit application that's submitted. That's the biggest, target we're hitting. So with that, if there are any other questions, the projects team's here and certainly available. This is a really neat picture. Not a lot of people have seen it, but it's actually the confluence of Allen's Creek. If you were to walk back up Allen's Creek, there's a bridge in the distance and you would be right back on BRA property. So.
All right. Questions? Director Bourne.
Go ahead, sir. So are we in the communication process of the permitting now?
We are gathering the data that will be completed in order to submit the application.
Okay. And then secondly, David and Madam Attorney, every time we meet, could we just have an automatic executive session posted, so with the exceptions that we need to be meeting under, in case we need to go into executive session to discuss anything?
Generally, what we try to do is, for transparency, we've always attempted to give pretty specific
Only under the
notice.
exceptions. I'm not talking about breaking any protocol, just the exceptions of contracts, litigation, possible litigation, anything that the law permits us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can assess what the information is, and if there's a basis for exception, we'll absolutely post executive sessions. Yes, sir.
Director Wilson.
John, can you go back to picture of the reservoir?
Let's see. Please close your eyes while I scroll quick here.
Right there. That one will work. So I think I understand. So the red and white line is probably where we'll put dirt, levee.
The levee.
Is that correct?
That is one alternative that it could
Okay.
be.
And so the west side is what y'all are calling the bluff. It's higher. Right.
Right through that area.
Well, what about the south and the north?
So this area is also on a higher ridge through here, which would be the south side coming around to the west. And I believe it carries on around almost to the meetup point of where that would be. It's a nice bowl shape, except for the one side.
So I got a couple questions. How much, and maybe we don't have enough information, so when we get that levee, how much rainfall is it expected to I mean, what is the watershed for it?
That will be part of the additional studies that we'll need to
Okay.
do to get that information. How much does that impact, in addition to the pumping that we would do, kind of put together an operations model that takes that into consideration?
Okay.
I think the general thought is that more than 90% of the water in Allen's Creek will have to be pumped into the
Have to be
reservoir.
pumped. That's
Because
kinda
the
what I
reservoir,
was-
the watershed's pretty small and Allen's Creek is pretty small.
Well, if it's a small watershed, that
It's
makes.
going to be primarily pumped out of the Brazos.
Okay.
Yep.
And I guess my next question is a little hypothetical also. So when we start pumping water in and we're wanting to get as close to that 100,000 as we can, what if water starts going where we don't expect it to go? What is our liability to the surrounding landowners?
So that has to be part of the design of the levee to make sure that we can control the water that we're going to store. That's absolutely a large risk, for sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
On the future maps that we might see, it would be helpful for me if we saw the pipelines on there.
Okay.
Is that something we could add?
Absolutely, we can make that overlay.
And also for some of the acronyms, it's also helpful for me
Little legend down there?
if there's some type of a legend and if you print it out and then put the acronym. I mean, I can always look them up myself, but and I think for anything that goes to the full board, it'll be more helpful.
We'll make sure we do a better job of that and get maybe even an acronym list, a living list that we can have,
Perfect. That
It
might
helps.
go more pages as we go on.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Director Lattimore?
This may be apparent to everybody, but I think we ought to take out a life insurance policy on you. And the reason I say that is looking, I don't know, it's 5 or 6 slides down, that very complicated layout of all the different steps that we have to go through to get this permit. My question really revolves around every time this committee meets. It seems to me that we ought to get a brief overview from you on where we are on the project. And the experience that I'm talking about is it's real easy for things to just kind of go into limbo.
Right.
For instance, we make a submittal to the Corps of Engineers, and we know that they've got X number of months to evaluate it. I'm not saying that we need to be overly aggressive, but at the same time, we need to be sure that, and the gentleman that spoke to us a while ago, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but we need to be sure that they're getting everything that they need so that they process it as quickly as they possibly can. And he hit my hot button, which was to say that we want to have everything well organized so that they don't have any questions.
Absolutely. We need to be an active participant in the process.
But the reason I say we ought to take out a life insurance policy on you, I'm assuming that you're going to be the focal point for the BRA. Is that correct?
For a lot of times, that will be correct.
You're going to manage the project.
Right. It'll be myself, Rachel Lane, who will also program manager. We'll have varying roles on that, but correct, we will be
Okay.
the two main
Well-
points there.
We'll hope that you have good health.
And Director
Me as
Lattimore,
well.
to your comment, I think that the BRA wants this board to see our accountability of every dollar that we're spending and the timeline and holding our stakeholders accountable for what they owe the BRA to. Because at the end of the day, it's their work and our work. It's everybody's effort that's going to end up saving time and money.
Right.
Well, and David, I agree with you, and I think everybody here on this side of the table is very supportive of everything that you're doing. So
We're not that side of
Right.
it.
This has been very argumentative and confrontational.
I'm talking about
I'll
this
let
side.
you dig out of that one.
Yeah, I stepped into that hole sure as the world.
So along that same line, and I saw on the slide earlier about 18% of the project was kind of delayed because of weather and lightning, et cetera, et cetera. So where are we in this phase regarding on track and on budget?
So as Carrie laid out earlier in the scope, schedule, and budget earned value chart, we are trending on schedule to get all the work completed within the time frame that was specified. We are currently within the budget. We've actually been able to move the goalpost on the budget to a lesser number than what we asked for in approval through those savings. And so we are progressing on a very positive track.
And then I did notice in the numbers that she took out the cost for deferred things later on, or possibly having to do with the pump station and all that. Why was that taken out if it's still possible expense to the project?
So we decided not to do it right now because, again, trying not to advance one part of the project beyond where we need to. It still may be needed, and it hasn't gone away. The need for it, if it's realized, we will do the work, but just in the phasing of work to make sure that we're not spending money that we may not necessarily have to at this stage. That was the intent of that.
So I agree with that, but then as a board, what we end up doing is later on down the line, you come to the board and ask for more money, and it was originally in the thing, and then you took it out, and then, you know, so we're this back and forth, and then we as a board are wondering, are we over budget on the project? And so, I mean, I know this is not a voting thing, but I think I would ask that you reconsider taking those things out, because it gives a false, gives us, or me personally, it gives me a false look at the actual budget and expenses, and then later on, again, like I just mentioned,
Okay.
David's coming back to the board.
We can certainly make sure we represent that in a manner that, you know, y'all prefer.
Yep. That's it. Any other, Director Lloyd?
Can I just make a suggestion, David? And it's like the definitions list. Can we just have a notebook, maybe with tabs that are replaceable as we go, with a project overview, with maps, with the, you know, as we sit here, we don't have to go, what does that mean? People can look it up. They can look, how many acre feet are we talking about? What was, they haven't, I know it's in convene. I know that.
I hear you.
But I'm a paper guy
Yep.
and a visual guy, and it would help me at least. I don't know if anybody else wants this. And I'm thinking.
Looking at me, it hit me.
I'm thinking a 3-ring binder that's with replaceable tabs as we go, that you can show up with, replace this with this, or something like this. Just something to think about. I don't know if anybody else cares, but it would help me.
The binders I can bring back that,
Yeah.
over the years.
I don't want his. I want a new. I want to buy new binders. I don't want Rick Huber's
No, I've got
discarded
stacks
binders.
of them. The annual
If you
report.
can make
Good
my-
point.
If you make my
Any-
binder
any
red and
other-
black, Texas
Make him
Tech
feel
color.
better and take his binders, but I don't want one that he had.
All right. Any other questions? I've got a couple of points. So
I
Dr.
think it would be great if we could add to what Director Lloyd is saying, if we could put the update on budget and schedule in there too.
Yeah.
It'll be done online too.
Yeah. So,
No, you're a paper guy.
so I want to thank everybody. We've gone well beyond our scheduled time, but that has not been a minute wasted. I've got a couple of points or questions I wanted to bring up. A couple of these are in the weeds points, but so I'll make them first, and then I'll step back up a little broader point. I think it would be really important for us to look at the timing and our contractual agreement for this third-party NEPA EIS, so that the procurement of that contract is done and sitting waiting for when we need it versus waiting till we need it and then going to procure it. the NEPA rules changing could be our ally. I mean, we still don't know what that looks like, but that is a really encouraging development to hear. I think the record of decision for the EIS will be signed by whom?
Is that James?
Will that be
Typically, the commander of the Galveston.
the Galveston District? Galveston District, okay. So that district needs to be our new best friend. That's already been stated, but I think from a strategic perspective that the board, I would just ask the committee and then the board to consider. There's some subtleties in the way we're presenting this information that I think is backwards. Our priority for this project, if you look at other reservoir projects that take 10 years, and I'm restating something I said at the beginning, the driver of this has been the permitting process, not the engineering. And what you've presented to us today has been the engineering leading the permitting. I think as a group, we should focus on the permitting leading the engineering, and that leads us to the shortest amount of total expended time. The engineering should support permitting versus permitting support engineering. That's another way of saying it, so that our priority stays at the critical engineering pieces that are needed to get the permit achieved. So in many ways, it puts HDR in the lead and not Gannett Fleming, just to say that out loud as what I saw today. I mean, I really appreciate, James, your perspective and your experience here is outstanding and exciting to hear about. And I'm not trying to minimize Gannett Fleming's role. Don't get me wrong about what I just said there. It is that, just for example, the slide that had environmental and cultural alternatives, conceptual design, and regulatory permitting. That sequence leads us mentally to think about, that's the fourth quarter decision. Well, actually, it's in your game plan up front, and if you don't have it, then you're going to be losing in the fourth quarter, which gets me to the final kind of macro point. I think that we need to hold ourselves to a metric of a timeline of when we think we're going to be done, because nobody said that today about when our 404 permit is going to be issued. Is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 18 months? Is it going to be 3 years? We need to sign up to a date, because everybody knows right now, I think James could tell us with his experience what the time to get this done should be. If it is a best case, worst case scenario, we already know what the worst cases are going to be. Lake Ralph Hall or whatever. Everybody talks about this as a 10-year process. I mean, I think we ought to look at this as a 3-year process. I mean, what is that? What is that date? And I don't know if the committee's interested in pursuing that, but I think part of the comeback to us before the board is to have a recommended goal, and then hold ourselves to it. And that's where the partnership and the stakeholder, because part of that goal setting ought to be with the Corps. So what do you think is practical and reasonable now? Because they've got other priorities, but we want to try to influence their priority by them participating in that, as far as where we're going. And I think those are things that then, as Scott did an excellent job of putting the risk mitigation thing in there, then we're able to identify those areas of risk that are going to impact that goal. And then whether it's a political factor, whether it's a cost factor, or whether it's an engineering factor, then we can go after it based on that, so that it all comes together. So
one comment I want to make, and maybe we didn't illustrate this as well as we should, but to your point, the permitting and the engineering, it's all working together as we move through it. You're right, we didn't represent that correctly through here, but in our weekly meetings, it's the team of us. It's the project team talking about, okay, which considerations do we need to have? How does it impact, the engineering side, environmental? How do all these things play together? So we are very cognizant of that, but we will make sure that we illustrate that better in future meetings for y'all.
all right. Well, I want to thank everybody. Yes.
Can I ask one question? What does it look like for this committee moving forward? Are we meeting monthly, weekly, yearly? What does it look like?
It's a great question.
So today's meeting was to get all of this big foundation and get the committee up to speed. It's the first time the committee met. The thought is that this committee would meet prior to a board meeting, be an 8 or an 8:30 start, when we would have a 10:30 start board meeting. So there's a lot of people here that come from a long ways that would just be here for the board meeting. So
Is that every
it gives
board
an
meeting?
hour and a half or 2 hours before a board meeting to jump on the next, the next phase. So I would work with David and Matt to see where we are. And John, I always say John is the brains of the operation there, on when the committee meets next.
Okay, so not every board meeting,
No,
just some
no.
board meetings?
Right.
Okay.
The board meets, every other month, so it wouldn't be every time because, of course, we have security and the others as well. But we have determined that this would be the only committee meeting prior to a board meeting, so we would not try to do another one at the same time. So we would give this, a solid hour and a half to 2 hours.
Okay. Director Bourne.
I would say, talk about permitting, I would say direct staff to go after the low hanging fruit first, the easy stuff, get that out of the way. And go the next medium hard, and then save the hardest for the last. I mean, get the easy stuff out of the way first, and let, most people kind of put that off. No, go for the low hanging fruit first, clear it off. Maybe that helps speed things up. Certainly, we are being diligent in how we're working through the process.
Director Bourne.
As consideration, what you said is accurate. I like our chair's perspective on being very aggressive about getting this accomplished. And of course, I'd like to see it in our lifetime. That'd be an ideal kind of thing. And so being in a mode to make something happen which will benefit thousands of people in the state of Texas and our mission and goal, I think makes it move it to a high priority. And so whatever it takes to meet as needed or whatever we need to do, I'm available. And I'm high urgency on this, so that's my perspective.
All right, thank you for that. All right, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn at this time. All right, motion by Director Cron, seconded by Director Henderson. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. With no further business, the committee will adjourn at 12:15.
We get overtime pay.